Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the ISMTE 2021 Global event. My name is Xander Vaith, and I'm the Senior Publications and Digital Media Coordinator for the American Gastroenterological Association, and I volunteer with ISMTE in the North American Conference Planning Committee. I want to take a second to say that we have attendees from all over the world and time zones joining us for this event, so please take a moment to just let us know in the chat where you're joining from. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items to start off. For this session, the speaker discussion will be followed by an audience Q&A. So we're going to hold any questions until after the presenters have finished. However, feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation by using the Q&A field. If you'd like to direct your question to a specific speaker, you can indicate which presenter you're asking by typing an @ before their name. Also, be sure to upvote questions from other attendees that you find interesting, and we'll make every effort to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the speaker presentations. Before we get started, we'd like to express our gratitude to our sponsors for this meeting. Their support has enabled us to provide you with this virtual event. And neither of our speakers for this session have any conflicts of interest to declare. I'm excited to begin this session about diversity and peer review, where we'll explore perspectives and experiences on inclusion and diversity in peer review. After first focusing on the need and benefits, our speakers will discuss what a diverse reviewer pool looks like and how to get initiatives off the ground. Our first speaker is Cecilia Marshall. Cecilia manages the medicine, healthcare, technologies, and public health portfolio at Cambridge University Press. She is involved in a number of D&I initiatives, both with her journals and in the wider organization. She is co-chair of the Pride Network. Our second speaker is Mandip Aujla. Mandip is a senior editor at the Lancet Global Health. She is also a co-chair of the Lancet's group for racial equality. And with that introduction, we'll jump right into our discussion regarding diversity and peer review and the rationale for it. So Cecilia, Mandip, why do you find diversity in peer review important? Why do we need to think about it?
So I think diversity in peer review is fundamental. I mean, the role of peer review is to kind of provide a range of opinions on a piece of research with the aim of improving that work. And in order for that process to be successful, we need reviewers to be able to provide different perspectives from that of the author and to be able to challenge existing thinking. And I think it's really hard to do that without a kind of diverse set of reviewers to be able to choose from. You know, we've all seen examples of papers that have come through peer review and been published, and there's been a lot of questioning as to like how it's got through that process. And I think that speaks to the need for improving diversity in those peer review pools. What do you think, Mandip?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So I think peer review is essentially the quality control mechanism that us editors depend on to make sure that the most robust and relevant research is published. And I think, sadly, it's not uncommon for editors to rely on quite a narrow pool of reviewers. So the usual suspects who've been tried and tested and are regularly called upon. But by opening up that pool and inviting new voices, we get more interesting questions, reflections, and interpretations of research that can really challenge established ways of thinking and ultimately enrich the body of knowledge.
And I think you've touched on a really great point there, because we all know that editors, you know, especially unpaid editors, and we can talk about that in a bit more detail later, you know, they want that process to be quick. And so they're going to go to people that they know are going to provide a good review and have a quick turnaround time. So they end up depending on these really small networks of people. Now, one of the really big benefits of when we're thinking about diversity in peer review is often those initiatives go hand in hand with trying to expand reviewer pools, but also kind of widen reviewer engagement, both in terms of reaching a wider number of people by inviting them into the pool, but also for your existing, pool of your reviewers, encouraging editors to, seek out more diverse opinions to go into, specifically into the database to try and find a more diverse group of people. And I think one of the big things that I talk about with my editors all the time is the challenge of reviewer fatigue. And I think that's a really great way for us to, frame this narrative of you can do this amazing work to improve diversity in peer review, but that's also going to help you to resolve some of these issues around going to the same people time and time again.
I completely agree. And I think the one thing that the pandemic has really highlighted is this issue of fatigue among this small pool of reviewers, and particularly in some specialties. So we really saw it with our infectious diseases specialists. So by expanding that pool and asking those reviewers, for example, for recommendations of others, it also really helps to ease the pressure on people who might have also been drawn back into doing clinical work in addition to their academic stuff in the past year. So yeah,
I do think that it's not as easy to improve the diversity of the peer review pool as we imagine. I think one of the things that we'll need to think about is, in order to kind of break out of those existing networks, there might be people who want to be a part of the review process but don't have that experience yet. So we're going to need to think about how can we first bring those people in, but also is there training that we're going to need to provide? Like, how can we support them in understanding what good review looks like? And good review will look different depending on different journals. And I think also, when we talk about peer review, we're often thinking about like one specific type of peer review. So, just assessing the methodology of the manuscript and the work. But, I've been working on a special issue recently on primary healthcare in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And one of the kind of aspects of that special issue was inviting members of that community to provide like a cultural peer review of those papers and to make sure that it's from that community and representative, and ensuring that it's the kind of knowledge of that community has not got lost to sort of Western voices. And I thought that was a really interesting idea of like what we think about peer review is not always, one set thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because so, for example, in the past, when me or members of my team had been searching for reviewers, our main concern might be how many papers a particular person has published in a specialty. But now, in addition to that, we routinely consider things like gender and geographical location. And as you say, depending on the subject of the study, we might look for reviewers who represent particular populations. So it could be Indigenous communities, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, young people, or another example is mental health service users. So contextual review, like you say, is really, really important in addition to the technical review. And I think these perspectives that those reviewers can bring are so valuable to help us as editors like decide which papers are likely to have the most impact, so make the biggest difference to the lives of patients ultimately.
And I think there's a lot of certainly kind of qualitative evidence that, that kind of peer review is helpful. You hear a lot of feedback about how, they've received feedback that they weren't expecting, that has really challenged their thinking, that they're really grateful for the input. But I do think there's probably more to be done in this space in terms of trying to kind of scientifically sort of, quantitatively assess, diversity in peer review. And there's lots to unpack in how you would do that, but to try and kind of come up with a scientific approach to quantifying diversity in peer review and to look at the impact that has. And I think that will be the next kind of step in trying to kind of provide evidence that it's helpful for those skeptics that I'm sure we've all, come across around diversity. But I think certainly qualitatively, there's, I've had so much positive feedback from increasing diversity of reviewables. I don't know, with your work at the Lancet Global Health, what that kind of qualitative feedback's been like.
Anecdotally, the feedback has been very good from both authors and from readers. And I think authors really appreciate the insights as well that they gain from this wider kind of variety of reviews. But as you say, there's not much in the way of research that actually measures this quantitatively. And it's hard to measure. So that's kind of a work in progress at this time, I guess.
And I think that kind of comes on to another point, which is how do we start to think about diversity? You know, what does diversity look like? And I think there's so many different measures of diversity, so many different aspects to that. And it will look very different for different journals in different subject areas. You know, often the conversations that I'm involved with are around gender or, you know, geographical location of authors, career stage, things like that. But, you know, in different subject areas, that might be different. You know, I was speaking to someone who's based in an Iranian studies journal, and she was talking about the kind of initiatives they're putting in place to reach non-Iranian heritage authors to submit to the journal. So that's a really different approach. So I think we need to kind of expand our thinking of like what diversity might look like. And it's not sort of a one size fits all journals approach.
No, I mean, it's so multidimensional. There are so many different factors to consider, and it often also involves a lot of extra work. So editors have to be quite intentional about this process if they really are serious about diversifying reviewers. So they have to be ready and willing to put in the extra time as well to search and expand pools, and set targets as well. So, for example, on my journal, we had a target of 50% female reviewers. But we've only reached 40% so far, and it's something that we need to work on. So whether we need to oversample when inviting, or whether we need to do more networking and outreach work, that's something we have to be proactive about that, and we need to have a strategy. But equally, we also had a target to improve geographical diversity of reviewers. And last year, almost half of our reviewers were from the USA or the UK, but this year we've managed to get that down to only 29% of reviewers being from the USA or the UK, and we've managed to include reviewers from 79 countries overall. But that's been very intentional on the part of our team, and it's required a really consistent effort, and also reaching out to our editorial advisory board for recommendations too. So I think it's possible. It requires champions, I think, in different areas. So we have, for example, at work, we have a group of people who are championing gender. I'm involved in the racial and ethnic equity side of things. We have had champions for the geographical diversity. So yeah, it does require concerted and consistent effort, I think, to make these changes.
And I think that's one of the challenges that we might face, in the sense that there's a really big difference in, you know, what we can reasonably expect and ask in terms of time commitment from people who are, you know, paid members of staff who are going out and seeking those reviewers versus people who are, you know, volunteering their time in that role. And I think that's a really key point here, is that we're going to have to be able to find a way that we can kind of make these kind of initiatives scalable and work for people who potentially are time poor and don't have the time to kind of actively do, you know, all of that work, who potentially won't benefit from being attached to kind of a larger publisher, you know, who maybe has paid staff who can kind of do that work. So I think there's a lot to unpack there in terms of like how we can kind of find some best practice that is scalable and does work for, you know, those kind of like time poor editors. And I think, you know, we've talked a little bit about the fact it is really important, but I think there are definitely some challenges in terms of getting stuff off the ground, and we don't necessarily see a lot of work happening in this space, in particular with some measures of diversity. I think, you know, I've seen a lot of initiatives around gender and around geographical location, and, you know, race to a certain extent. But I think there's lots of other measures that we, you know, haven't really got to. So, you know, why is it that we're not doing that? And I think time is a factor, but I also think, you know, we really need to find a way to kind of pin down what that narrative is, to be able to go out to our editorial boards and really help them to understand the value of increasing, you know, the diversity in these peer review reports. And that comes back to the point around how can we quantitatively as well as qualitatively, you know, assess, you know, the impact of a diverse peer review pool so that we can share that with those teams.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that the responsibility isn't just on editors and publishers alone. I think senior academics who are serving on our boards, who are regularly authoring content for us, also need to play an active part in this, because this is about the wider research ecosystem. So they do need to be putting forward their junior colleagues or their colleagues in different countries and passing those opportunities forwards. We do see some cases of co-reviewing as well. It's not that common, but there are some senior reviewers who do that. So they'll bring one or two, maybe more junior colleagues on board and kind of coach them through the process, and they submit together. And I mean, we don't have any hard and fast rules on doing that, but it's always good when somebody does.
Okay, so you were talking about how we can get some initiatives off the ground, and how we can implement them. From maybe the editorial office perspective, like how would we gather this information and use it in a way that's actionable?
So I think, Xander, that's a really great point. I think there's a lot of challenges around getting initiatives off the ground that start with how do we get data to understand where we are. You know, we can all make assumptions about where we think we are in terms of diversity and assumptions about how we think, you know, our initiatives might be going, but without the data to be able to kind of measure that, it's really hard. And from a GDPR perspective as well, you know, we need to be able to kind of justify how we're going to action the information that we collect. And that can make it very difficult because, you know, when we're considering diversity, there's kind of the diversity that's much easier to kind of see, and therefore much easier to kind of invite people from certain communities, you know, thinking about gender or thinking about race, for example, or thinking about geographical area. It's kind of easy to identify those people to a certain extent because that kind of measure of diversity is visible, but that's not true for every measure of diversity. You know, if you're thinking about invisible disability, or if you're thinking about sexual orientation, you're not necessarily going to be in a position to kind of collect that data and then go out and say to an editor-in-chief, look, we want, you know, to expand the reviewer pools. We want people with invisible disability. We want you to specifically seek out people who identify as gay. You know, that's a much more difficult conversation. So there's a lot to unpack in that in terms of what is possible for us to collect. And being able to kind of justify that it's actionable and to be able to kind of think before you're collecting that data of what that action is going to be. And I think that can be a challenge in terms of getting initiatives off the ground. But I know you've done quite a lot of the Lancet Global Health in terms of initiatives. How have you kind of approached that?
I mean, we had a gender task force that kind of led on increasing gender diversity. So they're the ones that set out this rule to aim for 50% female reviewers, which then all of our journals have tried to apply. But we also have weekly editorial meetings where all of the editors from different journals come together to discuss manuscripts that we've got with a full set of reviews and how we want to proceed with them. And before, the discussions would be really centered on around the content of the review. But now, based on these discussions, the identity of the reviewer has become really important. So we share information on not only on their area of expertise, but also their gender and their geographical location to kind of hold each other accountable. So you can see at a glance the makeup of a set of reviewers for each paper, and we can question each other as to why have you got 4 male reviewers for this paper? Was it because, what was your approach? Did you try harder? So we have this approach of consistently holding each other accountable, really, and having really open conversations about this now, which seems to be helping a lot. And it helps to keep these issues of diversity at the top of everyone's minds every week in these meetings.
I think that sounds really productive. One of the things that I often think about, though, is when, you know, we talk about initiatives that are about gender or geographical location, is, you know, let's bring intersectionality into this for a moment. So thinking about the intersection of different identities, you know, how do we tackle this? Do we tackle it one by one? Do we start with gender and then move on to geographical location, then move on to career stage? Or do we take a kind of much bigger kind of intersectional approach to say, how can we include everyone? And I think there's a real balance there to find between making sure that our kind of initiatives, inclusion initiatives, aren't exclusionary, that we're not, you know, doing this work around inviting, you know, female reviewers, for example, but actually we're just inviting white reviewers from, you know, North American institutions. how can we do that intersectional? But there's a balance there between how can we be inclusive in a more general sense, but also being able to get initiatives off the ground more quickly, because sometimes that intersectional approach will take more time. So I think there's a really hard kind of balance to find there between those two things.
I completely agree. And I think all of these initiatives, well, from my experience so far, have really been event driven. So they have come about based on big world events or issues that everybody has seen on the news and been talking about. And that's really led us all to reflect on ourselves and our own particular fields and the work that we're doing. So from my experience, there hasn't been a time where we've just all sat down and thought about diversity from an intersectional perspective. It really has been on a case-by-case, almost one-by-one basis. And there's definitely a lot more to come. And I agree that it would be good to pause and reflect as well on whether taking an intersectional approach is possible and how it would be possible, because it would require time and commitment, and also a really in-depth understanding, I think, of everything, so that nothing is forgotten from that list, so nobody's forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes back to the point about, time. Like, it's much easier for us to kind of have these conversations, with paid members of staff versus volunteers. This July, I kind of organised Intersectionality Month at Cambridge University Press. And it was a staff network led event. And basically we kind of came together to talk on a number of themes from an intersectional perspective. And one of the reasons for doing that, to your point around this being reactive to, international events, is I think we need to shift our thinking to a certain extent of like, how can we move from being reactive to what's happening to being proactive about inclusion? After, what happened last year in the USA, there was this real kind of beginning of a conversation about race that kind of hadn't necessarily happened before. And in many ways that was incredibly positive. But I do feel like some of that momentum has been lost, from conversations that I've had, that some of that momentum has been lost because it's no longer kind of in the news cycle all the time. So how can we kind of shift from being reactive to being proactive about inclusion, and making sure that it's not just those things that are in the news and just those things that are visible that we're talking about? How can we tackle accessibility? How can we tackle inclusion of people with who maybe don't fall in the gender binary? I mean, that's quite a simple thing. We talk about gender a lot, but that's so often talking about the male and female, genders. We're not really talking about like how can we be inclusive of people with different gender identities or different gender expressions within that. So I think, there's a lot to kind of unpack there. But again, it's this balance of like, how can we be proactive? How can we be inclusive versus how can we get stuff off the ground now and be making progress now when we don't necessarily have the time with everything else that's going on to kind of sit down and pause and reflect and come up with this more proactive plan. So I think it is going to definitely be a process in terms of kind of that shift in thinking in the industry. But I do think that it is one that needs to happen.
Yeah, and progress takes time, and it could take a long time to see these changes that we want to see. And it's not even just limited to peer reviewers. So it's authors as well, ad board members, and also editors too. Like, we see the lack of diversity around us within the field. So there's a lot to do, and all of it connects. Everything is connected with academia as well, and the whole wider research ecosystem. So I think all of these initiatives require a lot more time, and we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves either, I think, to achieve a lot of progress very quickly. So we need to think carefully about what we're asking paid members of staff to do, and also the emotional cost, I think, on volunteers as well, when it's a subject that that's close to your heart, something that you personally relate to. There can be quite a large emotional toll as well in speaking about these issues and pushing them forwards and having those types of discussions. I don't know, if you agree on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that kind of point of invisible labour. So often it's people who are part of those communities or hold those identities who are kind of relied upon to educate others or to kind of bring that perspective into the conversation. And actually, that's something that, you know, other colleagues that you're working with won't necessarily have. You know, I'm in a same-sex relationship. I'm a co-chair of the Pride Network, and I have to spend quite a bit of time actually talking about, you know, issues to do with sexual orientation and gender identity within my organisation. And, you know, in my conversations with editorial boards, when we've been thinking about initiatives on peer review, there's been lots of conversation about capturing data on gender versus capturing data on sex and things like that. And I think there's lots to talk about there, but often that kind of conversation, people rely on me to have that conversation to do the kind of educating for them. And I think we do need to think about that, because there is this kind of invisible additional labour that is required. And how do we make sure that it doesn't fall on the same people all the time to be making that progress?
Exactly.
I mean, I think...
Sorry.
No, Mandip, you go, please.
No, I was just going to say it becomes like a tax, doesn't it, on minorities or, individuals from diverse backgrounds.
Yeah. So I think, you know, in terms of initiatives, in terms of practical steps we can take, I do think there's something in that of like, how can we take some of the work out of their hands? You know, we want to, you know, expand review pools. We want to open these networks up so that more people can get involved. So I think one of the things that we're talking about at Cambridge at the moment, and we're piloting, we've got a pilot with the Web of Science Academy, is basically to provide an opportunity for people who want to review for a journal but aren't kind of currently involved, to be able to basically just reach out to their journal and say, look, I'd love to review for you. And there's this like training opportunity that's provided for them. So that kind of removes some of the labour from the editors who are potentially volunteers and trying to find these people, but also remove some of the burden from them, because they know that they can just say, yes, I want to be a part of this, and there's something there for them, and trying to make that easy. So we're piloting that at the moment with a small number of journals for 6 months, and that will kind of come to an end early next year. But we've already had a lot of really interesting feedback about that, and that process involves that kind of like co-review, mentor-mentee review process, as well as some kind of like learning modules that you can kind of do online around like what good review looks like. And I do think, you know, something like that's really interesting in terms of being able to kind of break down those, you know, barriers, and for people who maybe read the journal but have never interacted with it, to reach out and say like, yes, I'd like to review, rather than necessarily having to do all the work of trying to work out like how you might become a reviewer and maybe go into the system and set up an account and hope that someone kind of contacts you. There's lots of kind of options there to make that more visible and to kind of flag it in the system and to say, you know, this person has, you know, expressed an interest in reviewing, they want to review, but also we know that the quality of the review is going to be there, sort of like from an editor perspective, going back to this narrative, because they've been trained to a certain extent. And I think for people who feel unsure about how to provide a peer review, I think that's a really useful tool.
Oh yeah, I think that sounds fantastic, because you're doing something real here to try and break down those barriers, and that's a very real barriers that do stop researchers from reaching out to us. And there's so many benefits, aren't there, for researchers to be involved in peer review as well, so the professional benefits of keeping up with the developments in their field, contributing to shaping the field, which is a really big part of review. They get to sharpen their appraisal skills, and also this opportunity to interact with journals and editors directly can also open up doors for future publishing or more review opportunities, because we often call upon our peer reviewers, commission them to write content for us as well. So it's a cycle that continues, and then we also call upon authors to review. So they're all linked together.
I also know of journals where either formally or, you know, very formally or kind of informally, the reviewer pool basically is the kind of like pool that then becomes the editorial board. And I think, you know, when you lock people out of peer review, as you say, you can be locking them out from those other experiences of getting on the editorial board, of being invited to become an author, you know, of winning peer review awards, because even though that might not feel like a lot, being able to get recognition for reviews, you know, we often see that, you know, people claiming recognition on Publons or asking for recognition through other kind of services to put into those professional development plans. And I think if you don't have access to that, it limits you in all sorts of ways. So I think by opening that up, there's a lot of benefits to the journal as well as the benefits to those people. And I think just a note to say that I think we do have to kind of humanize diversity. You know, we often talk about people in terms of like groups of identities, you know, people who are Black or people who are, you know, women or, you know, whatever it may be. But I think within that, it's actual individual people who do feel locked out, who do feel excluded today, who will be sitting there thinking, you know, I don't have a review that I can put on this, you know, piece of paper. And I wish that I did, you know, and I think taking it back to say, like, it's actual individual human beings here that we're talking about that are being impacted by what we're doing or not doing. And I think that's a really important message when we're talking to editorial boards and trying to get people on board here is like, you know, we all experienced exclusion to some extent, whether it's like something small, like just not getting an invite to a wedding you were expecting to, or, you know, if it's something really significant, we've all experienced exclusion. And I think trying to like humanize that and say, you know, there are people who feel excluded from your journal and people who could be incredible contributors.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're missing out as well as them missing out. So I think there's a lot of kind of interdependency there between what we can do for them, but also what they can do for us.
Yeah, and it benefits all readers as well. So it's the journal, the authors, the reviewers, and readers. So, and ultimately, it benefits the field, doesn't it? The field of research. So, yeah, I completely agree that it's all interlinked. In terms of getting editors on board, I think one approach is to really be firm and be clear on setting targets and holding each other accountable, like just to think about what it is, which areas do we want to diversify and expand in, and to what degree, like what are you aiming for? 50% more reviewers from lower middle income countries, 50% female? Is it something else? And it's going to vary depending on the journal and the topic as well. But I think if you do make a pledge, set a target, have something in writing, have something that you can hold yourselves accountable for, it goes some way towards making a difference.
And I think on that kind of accountability note, I do think what we've seen a lot more of is kind of public statements, I guess, of people's intentions around diversity. And I think that's a really powerful tool if you're in a position to do so, because it's not just a few individuals holding themselves accountable, but it's everyone being able to hold organizations accountable or hold journals accountable. But again, that's really different depending on the kind of context of your individual journal. You know, if you're a large publisher making a commitment, that's one thing. If you're an individual journal that's self-published, that's a really different kind of commitment to be making. So I think, you know, there is, you know, stuff going on in the industry at the moment where people are trying to, you know, publishing houses and, you know, learner societies are trying to take like a non-competitive approach to, you know, progressing kind of D&I initiatives. So the Royal Society of Chemistry, for example, have set up this initiative that we're a part of, and a number of others are. And I think there's a lot that can be done in this space in terms of kind of best practice that can be kind of then rolled out, because I think I think that's absolutely right, that we shouldn't see this as like a competitive thing. I think we all need to be helping each other to find something that works and is scalable and is, I guess, understanding of the nuances of like different types of publishers and different types of editorial offices and different types of journals, both in terms of kind of subject area and also in terms of scale. You know, it's one thing to achieve like diversity if you've got a really small journal. You know, if you're publishing 20 papers a year, you know, that's a very small pool of people that we're talking about. But if you're publishing thousands a year, then obviously that's a much bigger group of people that we're talking about. So that like scale does come into play. And so I think there is definitely space, and we're at the beginning of this kind of creation of like best practice that we can roll out. And I think we do need to make sure that peer review is a part of that, and the reviewer pool is part of that, as well as thinking about kind of editorial boards and, you know, authors.
Yeah, and I think sharing experiences and sharing best practices is really so important on a subject like this. And the Royal Society of Chemistry initiative is a really great example. The Lancet is also a signatory to that as well. And we have some editors who are directly involved. But yeah, I agree as well. It's collaboration, not competition for an issue like this.
So thank you for your discussion and perspectives on that. I know we have some time for questions from the audience. I think one of them kind of goes hand in hand in what you were just talking about. So what advice do you have around educating and training editors and reviewers to think about DEI issues in the editorial decision-making and peer review processes, since they may be at different stages of awareness?
Mandip, did you want to speak to this first?
Yes, okay. So one approach that we've used is to hire an external speaker to come in and offer that training to our editors. And we've taken a really back to basics approach, for example, on race and ethnicity, for this speaker who's an expert in this, to really go back to the beginning, explain what the issues are, and really kind of get people thinking about what they need to be aware of, and perhaps unconscious biases that people hold. I mean, we all do. So I think the first stage is to look externally for speakers who can provide this training, and just avoid depending on your minority staff internally to do this.
I think that sounds great. I mean, I think from my experience with my kind of editors, as you say, people are at really different stages of thinking about this. And I think to a certain extent, it's kind of subject dependent. You know, people may have come across similar conversations kind of in their roles outside of the journal. I mean, I think for me and at Cambridge, we try to. So, you know, just one example is like in our editorial board reports that we send to editors, we have a section where we talk about diversity and inclusion initiatives that we're doing. So that's like just one step. But also we are trying to make sure that when we're having editorial board meetings or when we're having strategy sessions, that diversity and inclusion is a part of that, and that it's kind of a key topic. And I think you do have to go into those conversations understanding that there are people who are at different stages. You know, there are people who are really hot on this. There are people who are really hot on certain subjects, you know, who are really keen on gender diversity, but maybe haven't really tackled other bits yet. So you are at different stages. But I think for us, one of the really big things is like we have to get talking about it, and we have to be providing information to them and being in a position where we can answer questions. So, you know, we're sort of educating ourselves internally on issues around diversity and inclusion. So when we go out to those external conversations, we have, you know, information that we can provide, that we have answers that we can give, but also encourage them to go away and kind of do their own research. But I think that kind of comes back to the point around we do need to also be thinking about kind of how can we take like a scientific approach to this? How can we get that kind of quantitative information about, you know, what the impact is of that? Because I think sometimes, you know, you begin these conversations and the kind of conversation, the questions come back to you like, well, how do we know? How are we going to measure this? How do we know what, you know, that it's going to have an impact? And I think we do need, especially, you know, for people who in their sort of research really rely on quantitative information, to be able to kind of point to some of that, to be able to like, here's some data, I guess, to back up what we're saying and what we know to be true kind of qualitatively. But I think, you know, it is a really sensitive thing. And I think there are definitely some questions and concerns. But I think for me, the biggest thing is that like we just have to get the conversation going and keep that conversation going and build that momentum. And you know, I've been working with people who over the last couple of years have gone from knowing absolutely nothing to knowing a lot. So I think by doing that over time, thinking about, you know, what you said about Mandip, that is going to take time, that, you know, people can change and do change. And I think that's something that we, you know, need to be doing, is having those conversations.
Yeah, and I would just add, about measuring change is really impossible without the baseline data. And for race and ethnicity, as my kind of focus area, we really are limited by, as we talked about before, data protection regulations, the different definitions, and the voluntary nature of disclosure. So it's going to be really hard, even with our efforts, to measure the change, the progress that we do make. But these discussions are ongoing with our publishers to try and kind of counteract that. So like you said, Cecilia, the important thing is to keep the discussions happening and then make sure they continue.
Okay, so we've probably time for at least one more question. So one from the chat was, going by the sessions we have had, I would like to know where we as publishers are heading towards double-blind peer review or transparent one. Which one do you think will be more achievable?
So that's a really interesting question, and I think something that a lot of publishers are grappling with, because people have quite strong feelings like either way. Big open science advocates are really big fans of open peer review, or transparent peer review, where the reports are open but the names aren't attached, versus the people who are really strong advocates of double blind peer review. I think this is one of those situations where that quantitative data is going to be so important. So I know the British Ecological Society are doing, I think a 2-year-long piece of work around the difference between kind of single blind peer review and double blind peer review. And I think the outcome of that will provide a lot of interesting insight into kind of what the value is of double blind versus single blind, and whether that does have an impact on bias or perceived bias. So that's something that I know I'm personally looking out for. I mean, I think my feeling is that as we kind of transition towards open access, and as we transition towards more open science and open data, that the kind of natural continuation of that will be open peer review. But I do think that there's still work to be done in trying to understand what impact that might have. Again, this quantitative situation is what impact that might have on people's biases or not. So I think I don't have an answer is the short answer, but I do think there's more to come in this space in terms of trying to unpick that question of what is better in terms of diversity and inclusion, double blind versus open.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add further to that, really. That just that it really does depend on the pilot, data that comes out in the future.
Okay. We have one last question, which if we want to try to answer it quickly. It's, do you think that checklists may help?
So I think this is, I'll try and be concise, but I think that's a really challenging question. I think quotas can be really helpful. I think checklists can be really helpful. I think there's a lot of challenges around what information we have to be able to tick boxes, and the challenges around collecting data in certain third-party systems that we frequently use, like Scholar One or Editorial Manager, which have very different approaches to that kind of information. So I think, yes, maybe in certain contexts, but I don't think certainly at this stage it's something that kind of universally would help. Mandip, what are your thoughts on that?
I wonder, Anusha, if you could expand to checklists. You mean in identity of reviewers, or I'm just checklists more? I'm not sure I understand. Is it a checklist in terms of checking boxes when inviting reviewers, or?
I'm not sure. It doesn't say anything beyond that. Potentially checklists as far as the different kinds of diversities we're trying to people responsible for selecting reviewers.
Oh, okay. So for editors, for example, to select diverse reviewers. I mean, it's very difficult as well, because there's such a broad range of ways. People don't neatly fit into boxes when it comes to identity. So it's difficult. It is difficult because no system is 100% perfect. So I think reliably capturing diversity and to put that checklist together in the first place will probably require a lot of discussion and work and data analysis as well. Sorry, that's not a very helpful answer, but I just think it's really difficult, to neatly put people in boxes.
Well, we are just about at time, so I want to thank you all for attending this session, and to our presenters, Cecilia and Mandip. I appreciate all of your discussion and input. We would love to stay connected with everyone, so if you're on social media, you can use our hashtag, which is hashtag ISMTE Global, to find and share content. Be sure to stop by the Exchange Forum. I'm going to put my email address in the chat, so if you have any questions beyond this that we potentially didn't get to, feel free to send them to me through email, and I can always funnel them to our speakers. But other than that, thank you all once again for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you again soon.